What if the most dangerous thing on a ship was not the storm, not the cold, not the enemy waiting beyond the horizon, but the men themselves? 65 bodies, one narrow wooden vessel, 3 weeks on freezing seas, with no toilets, no plumbing, no sanitation system of any kind. Just salt spray freezing on wool cloaks, breath turning white in the air, smoke clinging low over the deck, and the unavoidable reality of human waste in a space barely wider than a modern truck. By every rule of later naval history, this should have been a floating death trap, and yet it was not. While entire crews of much larger and better equipped ships would later die from disease in weeks, these men crossed the North Atlantic in winter, reached Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, and came back alive. The mystery is not how they sailed. The mystery is why they did not rot from the inside out. A Viking longship measured roughly 30 meters in length and barely 3 meters across, a space so narrow that 60 men lived almost on top of one another for weeks at a time. They rowed in shifts, slept between the benches, and ate from shared provisions while icy spray soaked their wool clothing again and again, never fully drying in the cold wind. There was no lower deck to retreat to when storms rose, no enclosed space to escape the cold. During winter crossings, men remained exposed day and night, hands cracking from salt and frost, breath filling the air with damp vapor that froze onto wood, rope, and skin. By every medical expectation of later centuries, disease should have spread instantly. One case of dysentery should have crippled the crew. One contaminated ration should have cascaded into disaster. One outbreak of lice should have ignited epidemic typhus. This is how ships died throughout history, but Viking ships did not. And when outsiders finally encountered these crews, what shocked them was not filth, but something far more disturbing to medieval observers: cleanliness. Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote with open astonishment about Norsemen who washed themselves every single day, even in bitter cold, even when water numbed the hands and stole the breath from the lungs. To him, this was not merely unusual, it was unsettling. English chroniclers echoed the same disbelief centuries later, complaining that Vikings bathed so consistently that Saturday itself became known as Washing Day, a linguistic trace that still survives in Scandinavian languages today. Their grievance was not violence or raids, but hygiene. Archaeology confirms the pattern beyond doubt. Graves across the Viking world are filled with grooming tools, finely carved combs, tweezers, and ear cleaners shaped from bone and antler, worn smooth from constant use. These were not luxuries or status symbols. They were carried everywhere, even aboard ships bound for icy seas. This was a culture that treated grooming not as vanity, but as discipline, not as appearance, but as order, which raises an impossible question. How did people so rigorously devoted to cleanliness survive on ships built with absolutely no sanitation infrastructure at all? The answer begins not with what Viking ships contained, but with what their builders deliberately refused to include. In the cold months at sea, when movement was dangerous and decks glazed over with ice, there were no latrines, no waste chutes, no hidden chambers below the benches. This absence was not ignorance, it was intention. The longship was never designed to function as a sealed environment. Its freeboard rose barely half a meter above the waterline, so low that in winter seas the ocean was always within reach, dark, cold, and constantly moving. Human waste was never stored, never confined, never allowed to linger. It was removed immediately and cast into salt water that diluted and disrupted pathogens in moments. When storms made standing at the rail unsafe, simple wooden buckets were used only briefly, then emptied at the first safe opportunity. Nothing accumulated, nothing fermented. Nothing remained long enough to become a biological threat. Centuries later, ships like HMS Thunderer sailed with everything Vikings supposedly lacked. They carried purpose-built toilets, trained surgeons, written hygiene regulations, and enclosed decks meant to protect crews from exposure. And yet cholera killed dozens of men within weeks. Waste chutes, concentrated contamination close to the hull. Drinking water stagnated and rotted inside wooden barrels. Enclosed holds became biological traps where disease incubated unseen. Viking ships avoided this fate not through greater sophistication, but through refusal. They refused to contain what could not safely be held. They refused to seal their environment and trap contamination inside it. Cold wind, salt spray, and constant exposure created conditions hostile to bacteria. The ocean itself became their sanitation system, not by engineering theory or written design, but by daily practice shaped by necessity and reinforced by experience. Winter sailing amplified every condition aboard a Viking ship. Cold slowed decay. Salt burned exposed skin and suppressed microbes. Wool garments retained warmth even when soaked by freezing spray, allowing bodies to endure conditions that should have been lethal. But the greatest advantage was not found at sea. It was found in the ability to leave it. Viking ships drew barely 1 meter of water, so little that they could beach almost anywhere. Frozen sandbars, gravel shores, river mouths edged with ice. Where other vessels required deep harbors and built ports, Viking crews needed only momentum and tide. In the cold season, this mobility became decisive. Every landing allowed exhausted bodies to recover, waste to disperse naturally into soil, clothing to be washed in streams, and fires to be lit for the first time in days. The ship was never meant to contain life indefinitely. It was a passageway, a bridge between landfalls, not a world meant to be endured without end. Daily combing among the Vikings was never a personal choice. It was a social expectation, enforced through reputation, shame, and collective discipline in an environment where negligence endangered everyone. Lice were not a nuisance. They were vectors of epidemic typhus, a disease that erased medieval armies without a single battle being fought. By physically removing parasites each day, Viking crews broke the chain of infection before it could begin. Weekly bathing served the same purpose. Even in cold water, even in harsh weather, immersion disrupted reproductive cycles and reduced infestations long before symptoms appeared. These rituals persisted at sea and on land, in winter and summer, not because Vikings understood bacteria or disease theory, but because generations had observed the results and passed the behavior forward. What later observers mistook for vanity was something far more practical. Beauty emerged not as an ideal, but as a byproduct of survival. One of the deadliest threats in maritime history was invisible, odorless, and carried in plain sight. Water barrels killed sailors centuries after Vikings had already crossed the Atlantic. Wooden staves absorbed contamination, bacteria multiplied in darkness, and within weeks, drinking water became lethal. The Vikings avoided this fate almost by accident. Fresh water was heavy and impractical for long voyages, so they provisioned differently, not through science, but through necessity. They carried weak beer and sour milk. Beer production required boiling, a process that unknowingly killed most pathogens. Fermentation lowered acidity, creating an environment hostile to bacterial growth. In freezing conditions, these drinks provided calories, hydration, and safety all at once. They were never intended as medical solutions. No theory guided their use. They were chosen because they lasted, tasted better, and did not make crews sick. What later navies would learn through tragedy, the Vikings learned through habit. They did not trust stored water, and in doing so, they unknowingly removed one of the greatest killers at sea. Viking hulls leaked constantly, a condition later shipbuilders would have considered a fatal flaw. The overlapping planks admitted seawater through tiny gaps, not enough to endanger the vessel, but enough to demand regular bailing by the crew. This ceaseless movement of water mattered more than it seemed. Organic debris that fell into the bilge, food scraps, spilled liquids, accidental contamination, never had time to stagnate. Saltwater mixed, diluted, and was removed again within hours. The bilge remained dynamic rather than sealed. There were no dark pockets where decay could concentrate, no enclosed reservoirs where bacteria could thrive unseen. Later ships pursued tighter hulls and deeper holds, sealing contamination inside spaces that were rarely flushed. Those vessels paid the price in sickness and death. The Viking ship followed a different logic. It accepted imperfection, adapted to it, and transformed constant leakage into a form of self-cleaning. What appeared crude was in fact quietly efficient. The Vikings did not survive the cold Atlantic because they were fearless, or reckless, or unusually strong. They survived because they refused to let problems accumulate until they became lethal. They did not battle waste or attempt to control it through complex systems. They removed it before it could take root. They did not seek to conquer nature or seal themselves off from it. They worked with wind, water, cold, and movement, shaping their lives around forces they understood through experience rather than theory. Their ships carried no toilets, no pipes, no infrastructure meant to manage human excess. And yet this refusal preserved life, where later empires, armed with regulation and technology, repeatedly failed. If this story echoes something from your own family history, a migration, a settlement, a season of hardship endured through adaptation rather than strength, that memory belongs here as well. Liking, subscribing, and sharing are not casual gestures. They are quiet acts of preservation, small ways of keeping fragile knowledge alive. Because history does not disappear when ships rot or settlements fade. It disappears when no one remembers why people survived at all.